What if the moment you stopped explaining yourself was the exact moment people started respecting you? This audiobook reveals why confident people never justify their choices to anyone, and how you can finally stop performing for approval you were never going to get anyway. Think about the last time you made a decision and immediately felt the urge to explain it. Maybe you turned down an invitation and found yourself listing 3 reasons why. Maybe you left a job, ended a relationship, changed your appearance, or simply said no to something small, and within seconds you were already building a case, already rehearsing your defense, already preparing for an interrogation that no one actually launched. If this sounds familiar, you are not alone, and you are not weak. You have simply been trained quietly and over many years to believe that your choices require a permission slip signed by everyone around you. This audiobook exists to dismantle that belief completely. Here is the truth that most people never confront. Over-explaining is not politeness. It is not maturity. It is not thoughtfulness. Even though it wears that costume so convincingly that you have probably defended it as a virtue, over-explaining is a survival strategy. One you likely built long before you had the language to understand what you were doing. It is the sound of a nervous system trying to prevent conflict before conflict even has a chance to arrive. It is the voice of a person who learned, somewhere along the way, that their worth was conditional on being understood, agreed with, or approved of by everyone in the room. And here is the part that stings the most. The more you explain yourself to people who were never going to accept your reasons anyway, the smaller you become in their eyes, not the more respected. Confident people operate by an entirely different set of rules. And it is not because they are careless or cold or indifferent to how others feel. It is because they have done internal work that most people avoid. They have separated their identity from other people's opinions. They have learned that a decision does not need external validation to be correct. They have discovered that the moment you start defending a choice, you have already signaled, on some subconscious level, that the choice might be wrong, that you might be wrong, that you are still waiting for someone else's stamp of approval before you can fully stand behind your own life. This audiobook is going to show you exactly how that shift happens, chapter by chapter, until the instinct to over-explain no longer controls you. We are going to look at where this habit comes from, often rooted far earlier in your life than you realize. We are going to break down the actual psychological difference between a confident brain and an anxious, approval-seeking one. We are going to expose the trap of constant validation seeking and why it silently keeps you small no matter how much you achieve. We are going to give you real language, real scripts, real phrases you can use in real conversations, so that the next time someone questions a decision that is entirely yours to make, you will not fumble for justification. You will simply, calmly, and without apology, be yourself. And by the end, you will understand something that will change the way you move through every relationship, every workplace, every family gathering, and every quiet moment of self-doubt for the rest of your life. You were never actually required to explain yourself. You only believed you were. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The hidden cost of over-explaining. There is a peculiar kind of exhaustion that comes from justifying yourself constantly. And if you have lived with it long enough, you may have stopped noticing it as exhaustion at all. It has become background noise, the mental tax you pay just to exist around other people, without triggering their disapproval. But make no mistake, it is a tax. And it is far more expensive than most people realize. Consider what actually happens in your brain every time you over-explain a decision. You are not simply communicating information. You are entering a state of low-grade defense. Your nervous system, the same one responsible for detecting real danger, begins treating a raised eyebrow, a pause in conversation, or a simple question like, "Why did you do that?" as a threat that must be neutralized immediately. Your heart rate ticks up slightly. Your thoughts start racing to construct a narrative airtight enough to satisfy an imaginary judge and jury. And by the time you finish your explanation, you are depleted, even if the other person barely reacted at all. Now multiply that by every decision you make in a single day. The outfit you wore, the meeting you skipped, the dessert you ordered, the career path you chose. If you are someone who over-explains, you are running this defense sequence dozens of times daily, and it is quietly draining a resource you cannot see being spent, your mental and emotional energy. But the cost is not only internal. Over-explaining changes how other people perceive you, and it rarely changes it in your favor. Think about the people you know who seem to command a room without raising their voice, who state a decision once and move on, who never seem rattled when someone disagrees with them. Now think about the people who, when questioned even mildly, launch into a 5-minute defense complete with backstory, justification, and preemptive apology. Which one do you trust more? Which one do you believe actually knows what they are doing? There is a reason. Confidence reads as competence in nearly every social and professional context. When you explain too much, you are not just sharing information, you are broadcasting a signal, whether you intend to or not, that says, "I need you to agree with me in order to feel okay about this." And people, often unconsciously, pick up on that signal. It does not make them respect you more for your honesty. It makes them sense an opening, a place where your boundary might bend if they just push a little harder. There is also a subtler cost that unfolds over years rather than moments, and it might be the most damaging of all. Every time you justify a choice instead of simply owning it, you are reinforcing a story in your own mind that your choices are not valid on their own merit. You are training yourself, session after session, decision after decision, to believe that your judgment requires outside confirmation before it can be trusted. This is how self-doubt becomes structural rather than occasional. It stops being a passing feeling and starts becoming the architecture of how you make every decision, from the trivial to the life-altering. People who over-explain for years often report a strange, hollow feeling even when things go well in their lives, because success achieved through constant negotiation with other people's opinions never quite feels like it belongs to them. It feels borrowed, conditional, something that could be revoked the moment someone disapproves. Let's also talk about what over-explaining does to your relationships specifically, because this is where the damage often shows up most painfully. When you constantly justify your choices to a partner, a friend, or a family member, you are, without realizing it, training them to expect justification as the price of your autonomy. You are teaching them that your decisions are open for negotiation, debate, and revision if they simply object loudly enough or long enough. This does not create closeness. It creates a dynamic where the other person's comfort becomes the deciding factor in your life. Decision after decision, until you look up one day and realize you have built a life shaped more by other people's reactions than by your own values. This is not connection. This is a slow erosion of self, dressed up as consideration. There is a physical dimension to this exhaustion that deserves attention, because most people experience it without ever connecting it to the habit itself. Chronic over-explainers often report tension headaches after difficult conversations, tightness in the chest before confrontations that have not even happened yet, and a general sense of hypervigilance that follows them from one social interaction to the next. This is not an exaggeration or a metaphor. The body treats repeated anticipatory justification the same way it treats low-level, ongoing threat, releasing small amounts of stress hormones over and over throughout the day. Unlike an acute stressful event, which resolves and allows the body to return to baseline, this pattern rarely gets a chance to fully resolve, because there is always another decision on the horizon requiring defense. Over months and years, this can contribute to the kind of generalized fatigue that no amount of sleep seems to fix. Because the exhaustion is not purely physical, it is the accumulated cost of a mind that never fully stands down. None of this means confident people never communicate their reasoning. That distinction matters enormously, and we will explore it in depth later in this audiobook. There is a profound difference between sharing context because it serves a relationship and defending yourself because you fear disapproval. The first comes from security. The second comes from fear. And the tragedy is that most people who over-explain believe they are doing the first when they are actually trapped in the second, unable to tell the difference because they have never been taught what genuine confidence actually feels like from the inside. It is also worth acknowledging the opportunity cost hidden inside all of this. The things that never get built because the energy required to build them was spent instead on managing other people's reactions. Every hour spent rehearsing a justification, every ounce of mental bandwidth spent anticipating objections before they arrive, is an hour and an ounce not spent on the actual work of your life, whether that work is a relationship, a creative project, a business, or simply the quiet cultivation of your own peace of mind. People rarely calculate this cost because it is invisible. It does not show up on any balance sheet. There is no single dramatic moment where you can point and say, "There, that is where over-explaining cost me something real." Instead, it accumulates in 1,000 small withdrawals, each one unnoticeable on its own, until years later you find yourself wondering why you feel depleted, despite, on paper, having handled everything reasonably well. Here is what I want you to sit with as we move forward. Every unnecessary explanation you give is a small transaction. And in that transaction, you are handing over a piece of your authority to whoever is standing in front of you, hoping they will hand it back in the form of approval. Sometimes they do, often they do not, because the moment they sense you need their approval, some part of them, consciously or not, begins to withhold it, because your need has now become the currency of the interaction. Confident people refuse to enter this transaction in the first place, not because they are arrogant, not because they do not care what others think, but because they have learned, often through hard experience, that their peace is worth more than anyone else's momentary comfort with their choices. In the chapters ahead, we are going to trace exactly how that shift happens, starting with where this habit of over-explaining actually began. Chapter 2. Where this habit comes from. No one is born apologizing for their choices. Watch any toddler declare that they do not want to wear shoes, eat vegetables, or leave the playground. And you will notice something remarkable. There is no defense in their voice. There is no anxious scanning of the room to see if their refusal is acceptable. There is simply a clear statement of preference, delivered without a single ounce of guilt. Something happens between that moment and adulthood, and understanding exactly what happens is essential if you want to reverse it. For most people, the erosion begins early, often within the family system itself, and often with the best intentions from the adults involved. A child says no to something, and instead of that, no being respected as a valid expression of preference, it is met with a demand for justification. Why don't you want to go? Why won't you share that? Why are you upset? On the surface, these seem like reasonable questions, the kind any caregiver might ask. But repeated over thousands of interactions across childhood, a pattern gets encoded deep into the nervous system. One that says, my preferences alone are not enough. I must produce an acceptable reason before my choice will be honored. The child learns quietly and without ever being told directly that autonomy has a price, and the price is explanation. This pattern intensifies in households where emotional volatility is present, even in mild forms. If a child learns that a parent's mood can shift dramatically based on whether the child's behavior is deemed acceptable, the child becomes hyper-attuned to justification as a survival tool. Explaining yourself thoroughly and convincingly becomes a way to prevent an emotional storm before it starts. This is not a character flaw. It is an adaptive strategy, brilliantly effective at the time, developed by a nervous system trying to keep itself safe in an environment where a caregiver's approval was directly tied to comfort and safety. The tragedy is that strategies built for survival in childhood often become chains in adulthood. Long after the original danger has passed, the parent who once needed convincing is gone, replaced now by co-workers, partners, friends, and even strangers online. But the old defense mechanism remains fully active, firing in situations that pose no real threat at all. School reinforces this pattern in its own way. Academic environments are built almost entirely around justification. Show your work. Support your answer. Explain your reasoning. These are valuable skills in an academic context, where the goal is demonstrating understanding of a concept. But when this framework bleeds into personal decision-making, something goes wrong. A young person begins to internalize the belief that every choice, not just academic ones, requires a defensible thesis statement, evidence, and a conclusion that will hold up under scrutiny from an authority figure. Decisions about friendships, hobbies, appearance, and later career and relationships become subject to the same imagined grading system, even though no one is actually assigning a grade. Social conditioning adds another powerful layer, and it does not distribute evenly. Many people, particularly those raised to prioritize likability and cooperation above assertiveness, are taught from a young age that a good person considers everyone's feelings before acting. On the surface, this sounds like basic decency, and in many ways it is. But taken to an extreme, it becomes a belief that your own preferences are inherently less important than avoiding any possibility of another person's disappointment. Saying no without a lengthy, softened explanation starts to feel, on a deep emotional level, like an act of selfishness or even cruelty, even when the decision being made is entirely reasonable and entirely within your right to make without anyone's input at all. There is also the simple, painful experience of having your reasons dismissed even after you gave them. If you have ever explained a decision thoroughly, only to have someone respond with more pushback, more questions, or outright rejection of your explanation, you likely walked away from that interaction with a lesson burned into your memory, though not the lesson you might expect. You did not learn that explaining does not work. You learned that you must have explained badly, that a better, more thorough, more persuasive explanation might have succeeded where the last one failed. This is how the habit compounds over time instead of fading. Each failed attempt at justification does not teach the brain to stop justifying. It teaches the brain to try harder next time, to add more reasons, more context, more evidence, chasing an approval that was never actually available to begin with, because the other person's objection was never really about your reasoning in the first place. Culture plays its own quiet role in reinforcing this habit as well, often in ways that are difficult to notice because they are so deeply embedded in everyday language. Phrases like "who do you think you are?" or "don't get too big for your britches," or the more subtle but equally powerful praise reserved for people described as easygoing and low-maintenance, all send a consistent message that taking up space with unexplained, unapologetic decisions is somehow suspect, while shrinking, softening, and constantly accounting for yourself is somehow virtuous. Children absorb these messages not through direct instruction but through thousands of small observations, watching which behaviors earn warmth and which earn coolness or correction. By the time a person reaches adulthood, these lessons no longer feel like lessons at all. They feel like simple, obvious truths about how a good person is supposed to behave, which makes them exponentially harder to question, let alone unlearn. Understanding these origins is not about assigning blame to your upbringing or your past experiences. It is about recognizing that this pattern was learned, which means, crucially, that it can be unlearned. The nervous system that built this habit for protection can be taught, deliberately and patiently, that a different response is not only safe but far more effective. That process begins with understanding exactly what separates a confident mind from an anxious, approval-seeking one, which is where we turn next. Chapter 3. The Psychology of Confidence versus Self-Justification. Confidence and over-explaining cannot coexist in the same moment. Even though many people believe they can blend the two seamlessly, understanding why requires looking closely at what confidence actually is on a neurological and psychological level, because most people carry a distorted definition of it, one built more from movies and motivational posters than from actual behavioral science. True confidence is not the absence of doubt. Even the most self-assured people experience uncertainty, hesitation, and moments of second-guessing themselves. What separates confidence from insecurity is not the presence or absence of these internal experiences, but what a person does with them. A confident person can feel uncertain internally, while still projecting and maintaining decisiveness externally, because they have learned to trust the process of decision-making itself, not just the guaranteed correctness of every individual decision. They understand that being wrong sometimes is the acceptable cost of moving through life decisively, and that this cost is far smaller than the cost of constant hesitation and justification. Self-justification, by contrast, operates from an entirely different psychological foundation. one built on what researchers often describe as an external locus of validation. This means the internal sense of being okay, of having made an acceptable choice, is outsourced to other people's reactions rather than generated internally. When your sense of rightness depends on someone else nodding along, agreeing, or expressing approval, you have essentially handed the steering wheel of your self-worth to whoever happens to be in the room with you at any given moment. This is an exhausting and fundamentally unstable way to move through life, because other people's reactions are unpredictable, inconsistent, and often have nothing to do with the actual merits of your decision. There is a fascinating psychological phenomenon at play here, worth understanding deeply. When you justify a decision extensively to someone, you are engaging in what could be called anticipatory conflict resolution. Your brain is trying to solve a disagreement before it happens by flooding the other person with enough reasoning that they cannot possibly object. But this strategy backfires more often than it succeeds, because excessive justification frequently triggers suspicion rather than trust. Think about it from the listener's side. When someone gives you a simple, brief reason for a decision, you tend to accept it without much scrutiny. But when someone gives you an elaborate, multi-layered defense for something that did not require one, a part of your brain starts wondering what they are actually trying to convince you of, and more troublingly, what they are trying to convince themselves of. Over-explaining does not read as confidence. It reads, on some intuitive level, as compensation. Confident people also operate with a different relationship to disagreement itself. For someone who over-explains, disagreement feels like an emergency, a signal that something has gone wrong and must be immediately corrected through better reasoning. For a confident person, disagreement is simply information, a data point indicating that another person sees the situation differently, which is an entirely normal and expected part of being a person surrounded by other people with their own perspectives, values, and preferences. This reframe alone changes everything about how a person responds. Instead of scrambling to produce a convincing case, a confident person can simply acknowledge the disagreement exists without needing to resolve it, without needing the other person to come around to their point of view, and without needing the interaction to end in consensus. There is also the matter of internal narrative. The story you tell yourself about why you are making a particular choice. People who struggle with over-explaining often have an internal narrative filled with conditional language. Phrases like, "I hope this is okay. I know this might seem strange, but," or "I just feel like I should explain why." Confident people carry a different internal script entirely, one built on declarative statements. This is what I am doing. This is what works for me. This is my decision. The words themselves might never be spoken aloud in a given interaction, but the internal framing shapes the tone, body language, and energy of how the decision is communicated externally, even in silence. There is also a well-documented pattern in behavioral psychology, sometimes described as effort justification, and understanding it sheds further light on why over-explaining so often backfires. When people invest significant visible effort into convincing someone else of something, an odd thing happens in the mind of the person doing the convincing. The sheer amount of effort spent defending the position begins to feel, subconsciously, like evidence that the position itself must be shaky. Otherwise, why would it require so much defending? Confident statements, by contrast, carry an implicit signal of stability, precisely because they are not accompanied by visible strain. This is part of why brief, calm statements tend to be believed more readily than elaborate ones, even when the content of the elaborate explanation is perfectly reasonable. The delivery itself becomes part of the message, whether anyone intends it to or not. It is worth naming clearly that this psychological shift is not about becoming detached or indifferent to other people. Confident people are not confident because they stopped caring about their relationships or their impact on others. In fact, many of the most confident people are also deeply empathetic and considerate. The difference is that their consideration for others does not require them to abandon their own internal compass. They can hold both truths simultaneously. I care about how this affects you, and I still trust my own judgment enough to make this choice without needing your approval first. This is the psychological territory we are going to spend the rest of this audiobook helping you build, piece by piece, until it becomes your default operating mode rather than an occasional exception. Chapter 4. The Approval Trap. There is a specific kind of trap that catches highly capable, intelligent, and genuinely kind people more often than anyone else, and it operates so quietly that most people never realize they have been caught in it until years have passed. It is called the approval trap, and its mechanics are worth understanding in detail, because awareness of the trap is the first real step toward escaping it. The approval trap works like this. You make a decision, and rather than simply moving forward with it, you pause to check how it lands with the people around you. If the reaction is positive, you feel a small hit of relief and validation, and you register that decision as safe, as correct, as approved. If the reaction is lukewarm, uncertain, or negative, you feel a flicker of anxiety, and you begin, often without conscious awareness, adjusting either the decision itself or your explanation of it in an attempt to shift the reaction toward approval. Over time, through thousands of these small feedback loops, you stop making decisions based primarily on your own values and start making decisions based primarily on predicted reactions. The question quietly shifts from, what do I actually want to? What will generate the least resistance from the people around me? The insidious part of this trap is that it feels, from the inside, like emotional intelligence. It feels considerate. It feels like you are simply being thoughtful about how your choices affect others. And to some degree, in small doses, this instinct is genuinely valuable. It is part of what allows humans to function as social creatures capable of empathy and cooperation. But when this instinct becomes the dominant force behind decision-making, it stops being consideration and starts being self-abandonment. There is a meaningful difference between thinking about how your choice affects someone you care about and needing that person's explicit approval before you can feel settled in your own choice. The first is emotional maturity. The second is a trap. One of the cruelest features of the approval trap is that it is never actually satisfied, no matter how much approval you manage to secure. This is because the trap is not really about the specific decision in front of you. It is about an underlying belief, usually formed early in life, that your fundamental worth as a person is conditional and must be continually re-earned through the approval of others. Even if you successfully win over everyone in a particular room regarding a particular decision, the relief is temporary, because the next decision arrives almost immediately, and the process starts all over again. People trapped in this cycle often describe a persistent, low-grade anxiety that never fully resolves. Because there is no finish line. Approval is not a bank account you can fill up once and draw from indefinitely. It must be constantly re-earned, which means a life built around seeking it is a life sentenced to permanent, exhausting vigilance. There is also a darker consequence worth naming honestly. The approval trap does not just cost you energy, it actively shapes the trajectory of your life in ways that often diverge sharply from what you would have chosen if left entirely to your own judgment. Careers get chosen based on what will impress family members, rather than what genuinely interests the person choosing. Relationships get maintained past their natural expiration point because ending them would require an explanation that risks disapproval. Entire decades can pass with a person living according to a script written primarily to avoid other people's disappointment, only to arrive at a moment of reflection and realize, with a sense of grief that is difficult to fully articulate, that they cannot clearly identify what they themselves actually wanted, because that question was never given priority long enough to be answered honestly. It is worth pausing here to name something many people find uncomfortable to admit, which is that the approval trap is often most powerful in exactly the relationships that matter most. The ones with parents, long-term partners, or lifelong friends. Precisely because those are the relationships where the stakes of disapproval feel highest, it is relatively easy to feel unbothered by a stranger's opinion of your career choice. It is far harder to feel unbothered when the disapproving voice belongs to someone whose love and presence in your life you deeply value. This is why so many people can appear confident and unbothered in professional or casual settings while remaining completely trapped in justification loops within their closest relationships. The work of escaping the approval trap, in other words, is rarely evenly distributed. It tends to concentrate most stubbornly in the exact places where the emotional history runs deepest, which means genuine progress requires being honest with yourself about where the trap actually has its strongest grip, rather than assuming that confidence in one area of life automatically extends to every other area. Escaping the approval trap does not require becoming indifferent to others or abandoning empathy altogether. And it is important to be clear about this because many people, upon first recognizing this pattern in themselves, overcorrect into a kind of performative detachment that is really just another version of seeking approval. This time, approval for being unbothered. Genuine freedom from the approval trap looks much quieter than that. It looks like making a decision, noticing whether anyone reacts, and simply allowing that reaction to exist without needing to manage or resolve it. It looks like tolerating the discomfort of someone else's disappointment without immediately rushing to fix it through additional explanation or compromise. This tolerance, the ability to sit with someone else's disapproval without collapsing into justification, is perhaps the single most important skill this entire audiobook is trying to help you build, and we will practice it concretely in the chapters ahead. Chapter 5. Boundaries without apology. A boundary that comes wrapped in an apology is not really a boundary at all. It is a request, and requests can be denied. This distinction matters enormously, and once you understand it clearly, you will start noticing it everywhere, in your own speech and in the speech of everyone around you. Confident people set boundaries as statements of fact about their own life. Everyone else tends to phrase boundaries as questions in disguise, hoping for permission that was never actually required. Consider the difference between these two approaches to the exact same situation. Someone asks you to take on an extra project at work that you do not have capacity for. The apologetic version might sound like this. internally rehearsed and delivered nervously. "I'm so sorry. I really wish I could, but I've just got so much on my plate right now, and I feel terrible saying no. Maybe I could help with a smaller piece of it instead." Notice everything happening in that sentence. The apology up front, the justification through workload, the guilt explicitly named, and finally, the retreat into a compromise that was never actually offered as an option, generated purely out of discomfort with the initial no. Now consider the confident version. "I'm not able to take that on right now." 6 words. No apology, no justification, no offer of a lesser alternative to soften the blow. Just a clear, factual statement about capacity, delivered without emotional charge. The instinctive reaction many people have upon reading that second example is that it sounds harsh, even rude. This reaction itself is worth examining closely, because it reveals just how deeply the habit of over-explaining has become tangled up with our definition of politeness. A boundary is not rude simply because it lacks a lengthy justification. Rudeness involves disrespect, dismissiveness, or cruelty. A clear, calm statement of your own limits contains none of these things. What it lacks is not kindness, but performance. The performance of appearing agreeable even while declining to agree to something. Confident people have learned to separate warmth from over-explanation, understanding that you can be entirely kind in tone while being entirely brief in content. There is a practical mechanism at work here that is worth understanding, because it explains why brief boundaries tend to be respected more consistently than elaborately justified ones. Every piece of justification you offer functions, whether you intend it to or not, as an opening for negotiation. If you say no because of reason A, the other person's brain immediately, often unconsciously, begins searching for a way to address reason A. Perhaps they can solve the scheduling conflict you mentioned. Perhaps they can offer a workaround for the concern you raised. The justification, meant to close the conversation, actually reopens it, inviting a counter-argument you did not intend to invite. A boundary stated without justification offers no such handle to grab onto. There is nothing to negotiate because no reason was given that could be countered, disputed, or solved around. This is not manipulation. It is simply an accurate understanding of how conversations function. And confident people use this understanding, whether consciously or through years of instinct, to their considerable advantage. This does not mean context should never be shared. There is an important difference, one we touched on earlier and will expand on further, between sharing context because it serves the relationship and justifying a decision because you need the other person's buy-in before you feel entitled to make it. If a close friend asks why you are not coming to an event, and you genuinely want to share that you are exhausted and need rest, sharing that is an act of intimacy, not justification, provided you share it because you want to, not because you feel you must in order for your no to be considered legitimate. The test is simple and worth internalizing deeply. Ask yourself whether you would still feel at peace with your decision if the other person responded to your explanation with continued pushback. If the answer is yes, you were sharing context. If the answer is no, if pushback would send you scrambling for a better reason, you were not sharing. You were pleading a case, hoping for a verdict of approval that would allow you to finally feel settled in a decision you had already made. It is also worth addressing directly what happens when someone reacts poorly to a boundary delivered without justification, because this is often the exact moment that sends people rushing back into old patterns. If you state a limit plainly, and the other person responds with visible frustration, repeated questioning, or an attempt at guilt, the instinct will be to soften immediately, to backfill the missing explanation in hopes of smoothing things over. Resisting this instinct does not mean becoming rigid or refusing all further conversation. It means recognizing that another person's frustration with your boundary is information about them, their expectations, and their own comfort with limits, not proof that your boundary was somehow illegitimate. A boundary does not become invalid simply because someone dislikes it. If anything, a boundary that is only respected when it is met with agreement was never really a boundary at all. It was a suggestion that happened to go unchallenged. Building this skill practically requires tolerating an uncomfortable gap. The silence or mild tension that follows a boundary stated plainly, without the usual cushioning. This gap will feel unnatural at first, almost unbearable if you have spent years filling every such moment with justification. Resist the urge to fill it. Let the silence exist. Let the other person process your boundary without your help managing their reaction to it. This single practice, tolerating that gap without collapsing into explanation, done repeatedly over time, is one of the most powerful tools for rewiring the nervous system's association between boundary setting and danger. The gap will not feel comfortable for a long while, but comfort was never actually the goal. Freedom was. Chapter 6. Reading the Room. When explanation is actually needed. Everything we have covered so far might leave you with the impression that explanation itself is the enemy, something to be avoided in nearly every circumstance. That is not quite right. And getting this distinction wrong can send you swinging from one extreme to another, trading chronic, over-explaining for a rigid, brittle silence that damages relationships in a different, but equally real way. Confidence is not about never explaining yourself. It is about explaining from choice rather than compulsion. And knowing the difference requires developing a kind of internal radar that this chapter will help you build. Consider also the role that timing plays in this distinction. Something rarely discussed, but genuinely important. A decision announced well in advance, giving others reasonable time to adjust their own plans, generally requires less accompanying explanation than a decision announced at the last minute, not because the decision itself is different, but because abrupt changes naturally raise more practical questions that deserve some acknowledgement. This does not mean last-minute decisions require elaborate justification, but it does mean a brief note of awareness. Something like, "I know this is short notice," can serve a genuinely useful social function without tipping over into anxious over-explaining. The distinction lies in whether that acknowledgement is offered once, calmly, as a courtesy, or whether it becomes the opening line of an extended defense that continues well past the point of usefulness. Start with the most basic distinction, the one between information and justification. Information is neutral. It answers a practical question, helps someone plan, or provides context that genuinely serves a shared goal. If a colleague asks why a project is delayed, explaining that a vendor missed a deadline is information, it helps them adjust their own planning accordingly. Justification, by contrast, is emotionally loaded. It exists primarily to manage another person's feelings about your decision, rather than to convey practical facts. If that same colleague responds to your explanation by expressing frustration, and you find yourself immediately adding additional reasons, apologizing repeatedly, or promising to somehow make up for a delay that was never within your control, you have crossed from information into justification, from serving the relationship into managing someone else's emotional reaction to you. Intimacy is another context where explanation genuinely serves connection, rather than undermining it. Close relationships are built, in part, on the willingness to be known, to share not just decisions, but the reasoning and feeling behind them. A partner who never explains anything, who treats every choice as a closed case requiring no context whatsoever, is not practicing healthy boundaries. They are practicing emotional withholding, and the two are not the same thing at all, even though they can look superficially similar from the outside. The test we introduced earlier remains useful here. Ask yourself whether you are sharing because you want this person to understand you more deeply, or because you need their agreement before you can feel settled. Sharing from the first motivation deepens intimacy. Sharing from the second motivation, even when it looks identical on the surface, quietly erodes your own sense of authority over your own life. There are also situations involving genuine impact on others where explanation is not just appropriate, but necessary. If a decision you are making will materially affect someone else, a shared living situation, a joint financial commitment, a parenting choice involving a co-parent, then providing context is not people-pleasing. It is basic respect for someone whose life is genuinely intertwined with the consequences of your choice. The key distinction here is impact, not mere opinion. Someone having a feeling about your decision is not the same as someone being materially affected by it. A friend who is disappointed you are not attending their event has an opinion. A business partner whose income depends on a decision you are making has genuine stake. Confident people learn to tell these apart quickly and calibrate their communication accordingly, offering real context where real impact exists, and offering nothing more than a brief, kind statement where only opinion exists. Professional environments deserve their own consideration here, because workplace culture often blurs these lines in ways that can be genuinely confusing to navigate. In many jobs, especially those involving hierarchy, there are real, structural reasons to provide explanation. Reporting relationships, accountability structures, and shared resources all create legitimate needs for context that would not exist between equals. The mistake many people make is assuming that because explanation is sometimes structurally required at work, it is always required. And this leads to justifying purely personal choices, using a certain number of vacation days, declining an optional social event, or setting an end time for the workday, with the same intensity they would use to explain a missed deadline that genuinely affected a team's output. Learning to distinguish between what your role actually requires you to account for and what you have simply grown accustomed to over-explaining out of habit is an ongoing practice, one worth revisiting periodically as your confidence grows. It also helps to notice the difference between a question asked out of genuine curiosity and a question asked as a subtle test of your resolve. Genuine curiosity tends to be light, easily satisfied by a short answer, and does not persist once a brief response has been given. A test of resolve tends to circle back, rephrase itself, Or escalate slightly in tone if your first answer does not produce the reaction the asker was hoping for. Learning to notice this difference in real time takes practice, but the signals are usually there if you slow down enough to register them. A shift in tone, a repeated question phrased only slightly differently, a lingering pause, clearly waiting for you to add more than you already have. Once you can identify which category a question falls into, deciding how much to say becomes far more intuitive than trying to apply a rigid rule to every situation you encounter. There are also situations where explanation is required by legitimate rules, contracts, or agreements you have entered into voluntarily. A landlord asking for notice before you end a lease. An employer requiring documentation for extended leave. A shared agreement among roommates about how decisions affecting the household get made. These are not examples of the approval trap at work. They are the ordinary structure of agreements you consented to as part of living and working alongside other people. Confidence does not mean rejecting every structure that requires some form of accounting. It means recognizing which structures are genuinely part of an agreement you chose to enter, and which are simply expectations that other people have quietly imposed on you without your actual consent. Expectations. You are free to stop honoring the moment you recognize them for what they are. There is a useful internal question you can ask in any given moment of hesitation, one that cuts through most of the confusion quickly. Would I still make this same choice, delivered in this same way, if I was certain no one would ever ask me why? If the answer is yes, and you find yourself explaining anyway, you are likely doing so out of habit rather than necessity, and it is worth practicing the discomfort of holding back. If the answer is no, if the explanation genuinely feels necessary for the relationship, the practical situation, or the shared stakes involved, then offering it is not weakness, it is wisdom. The goal was never total silence. The goal was choice, real choice, made consciously rather than compulsively, which is precisely what the next chapter will help you put into concrete, usable language. Chapter 7. The Language Shift. Knowing intellectually that you want to stop over-explaining and actually having the words ready in the moment are two entirely different challenges, and this is where many people get stuck. The old patterns are so deeply grooved into your speech that in the heat of an actual conversation, especially an uncomfortable one, your mouth will often default to the familiar script before your conscious mind has a chance to intervene. This chapter exists to give you new scripts, concrete and specific enough that you can practice them until they become as automatic as the old ones once were. Consider also the value of tone independent of word choice, since even the most carefully chosen brief statement can be undermined by a delivery that signals anxiety, a rising inflection at the end of a sentence that turns a statement into an implicit question, a rushed pace that suggests you are eager to get past an uncomfortable moment, or a nervous laugh that softens the words into something less certain than they actually are. Practicing these phrases out loud, paying attention not just to what you say but how you say it, matters as much as the words themselves. A flat, even, unhurried tone communicates settledness even when the content of what you are saying might otherwise invite pushback, while a hurried, apologetic tone can undermine even the most well-constructed declarative sentence. Begin with the most common trigger phrase, the one that almost always precedes an unnecessary justification. The word because. Notice how often your sentences default to this structure. I can't make it because. I'm going to pass on that because. I've decided to leave because. Every time the word because appears in a sentence about a personal decision, ask yourself honestly whether what follows is necessary information or unnecessary defense. A powerful practice is simply removing the word entirely from certain categories of statements and observing how the sentence changes. I can't make it. I'm going to pass on that. I've decided to leave. Notice that nothing is lost in terms of clarity. What is lost is only the implicit invitation for debate that the word because so often creates. Replace vague, apologetic softening with clean, declarative statements. Instead of, I'm so sorry, but I really don't think I can. Try this doesn't work for me. Instead of, I know this might sound weird, but I'd rather not. Try, I'd rather not. Instead of, maybe we could try. If that's okay with you, try. Let's try this. Notice the difference in energy these phrases carry. Even though the underlying message is often identical, the apologetic versions all contain an implicit question, seeking permission or forgiveness before the statement is even allowed to stand. The declarative versions simply state a fact about your own preference or decision without asking anyone to sign off on it first. Develop a small set of what might be called bridge phrases. Brief statements that acknowledge the other person's reaction without requiring you to justify the decision that triggered it. I hear that you're disappointed, and this is still what I'm doing. I understand this isn't what you were hoping for. I know you see it differently, and I've made my decision. These phrases do something important. They validate the other person's emotional experience, which is often what they actually want in the moment, without treating that validation as an opening to renegotiate the substance of your choice. Many people over-explain because they conflate acknowledging someone's feelings with conceding to their objection. These bridge phrases let you do the first without doing the second. Practice the pause. One of the most underused tools in any conversation involving a boundary is simply allowing silence to exist after you state your decision. Most people, uncomfortable with the tension of an unanswered statement hanging in the air, rush to fill it with additional reasoning. Instead, after stating your decision clearly, physically close your mouth and wait. Let the other person respond, however they are going to respond. If they push back, use one of your bridge phrases and then pause again. This rhythm, statement, pause, bridge phrase if needed, pause again, is remarkably effective at ending justification loops before they even begin, because it denies the conversation the fuel of your anxious over-explaining, which is usually what keeps these exchanges going far longer than they need to. Rehearse difficult conversations before they happen, not by scripting elaborate justifications, but by scripting brevity. If you know a particular conversation is coming, a decision to decline a family obligation, a plan to leave a job, a boundary you need to set with a friend, spend a few minutes beforehand identifying the single sentence that captures your decision, and commit to that sentence as your anchor. Write it down if it helps. Say it out loud in an empty room until it feels natural rather than rehearsed. The goal is not to sound robotic or cold when the moment arrives. It is to have a stable anchor point you can return to if the conversation starts pulling you back toward the old habit of elaborate justification. It is worth adding one more layer to the language shift, which is learning to notice the words that soften a statement into something that sounds more like a question than a decision, even when no question mark is present. Phrases like "I was thinking maybe," or "Is that okay?" or "Does that make sense?" tacked onto the end of an otherwise clear statement, quietly convert a decision into a request for validation. Try saying a boundary out loud both ways, once with the softening tag attached and once without it. And notice how differently each version lands, even to your own ear. The version without the tag will likely feel more exposed at first, almost too blunt. But this feeling fades with repetition, and what replaces it is a growing sense that your words carry weight simply because you said them, not because someone else confirmed they were acceptable to say. Finally, give yourself permission to end a conversation that has become circular. If someone continues pushing for justification well past the point where you have clearly and kindly stated your position, it is entirely acceptable to say something like, "I think we see this differently, and I need to leave it there for now." And then actually leave it there. Whether that means changing the subject, ending a phone call, or simply not responding further to repeated messages on the topic. This is not rudeness. It is the practical application of everything this audiobook has been building toward. The understanding that your decisions do not require unanimous consent to be valid, and that your peace does not have to wait for someone else's full agreement before you are allowed to have it. Chapter 8. Handling pushback and social pressure. Even with the best language and the clearest internal boundaries, you will encounter people who push back, sometimes persistently, sometimes skillfully, against your refusal to over-explain. Understanding the common forms this pushback takes and preparing for them in advance will make the difference between holding steady and collapsing back into old patterns under pressure. The first and most common form of pushback is what might be called the repeated question. You state your decision, and rather than accepting it, the other person simply asks why. Again, sometimes rephrased, sometimes identical, as though your first answer or your first refusal to elaborate was somehow incomplete. The instinct here is to believe that your original response must not have landed, and that a better, more thorough answer might finally satisfy them. Resist this instinct. In most cases, the repeated question is not actually seeking new information. It is testing whether your boundary will hold under mild pressure. The appropriate response is not a new, longer answer, but a calm repetition of your original position, sometimes called the broken record technique. As I mentioned, this is what I've decided. I understand you have questions, and this is still my answer. Repeating the same calm statement, without escalation and without additional justification, communicates something pushback cannot easily overcome, that your position is not going to shift based on repetition of the question. The second common form of pushback is guilt, often delivered through statements about how your decision affects the other person emotionally, even when the actual impact is minimal or non-existent. This is going to really disappoint your grandmother. I guess I'll just have to figure it out on my own then. After everything I've done for you, this is what I get. Guilt-based pushback is particularly effective against people with a history of over-explaining, because it directly targets the exact fear that drove the original habit, the fear of being seen as selfish or uncaring. The most useful response to guilt-based pushback is to separate the other person's emotional experience from the validity of your decision. You can hold genuine compassion for someone's disappointment while still maintaining that their disappointment does not obligate you to change your choice. A brief acknowledgement, followed by a return to your position, tends to work far better than either dismissing their feelings entirely or capitulating to avoid the discomfort of causing them. The third form worth naming is the comparison tactic, where someone points to another person's more accommodating behavior as an implicit or explicit standard you have failed to meet. Your sister never has a problem helping out. Other people would just say yes, without making it complicated. This tactic works by trying to activate social comparison anxiety. The fear of being seen as uniquely difficult or unreasonable. It is worth remembering, when this tactic appears, that you have no actual insight into what agreements, resentments, or private costs exist behind someone else's apparent willingness to comply, and that your decision does not need to match anyone else's decision-making pattern in order to be legitimate. The fourth form, more common in professional or hierarchical contexts, involves an implied threat to a relationship or opportunity if you do not provide sufficient justification or ultimately comply. This is a more serious category, because sometimes the threat is real and carries genuine consequences worth weighing carefully, and it would be irresponsible to suggest that confidence alone resolves every situation involving actual power imbalances. What this audiobook can offer here is a distinction worth making clearly for yourself. The difference between a consequence that is a legitimate structural reality, losing a role you have not fulfilled the requirements of, and a consequence that is being used purely as leverage to punish you for asserting a reasonable boundary. The first requires practical, strategic thinking about your options. The second, while sometimes requiring careful navigation depending on your circumstances, does not require you to abandon the underlying principle that you are not obligated to over-explain simply because someone with more power than you demands it. It is worth adding a fifth, subtler form of pushback here, one that does not involve direct confrontation at all, but rather a kind of quiet withdrawal of warmth following your boundary, a coolness in tone, a shorter reply than usual, a noticeable change in how someone treats you in the days following your decision. This form of pushback can be more disorienting than the loud, obvious kinds, because there is no specific statement to respond to, only a general sense that something has shifted. The temptation here is often to reach out proactively, over-explaining after the fact, in an attempt to repair a rupture that may not even be as significant as it feels. Before doing so, it is worth simply allowing some time to pass and observing whether the coolness resolves naturally as the other person adjusts to your new boundary, which is common, rather than assuming immediately that repair work on your part is required. Underlying all of these tactics is a simple truth worth internalizing deeply. Pushback is not evidence that your boundary was wrong. It is evidence, more often than not, that your boundary is working exactly as intended, disrupting a pattern in which the other person had grown accustomed to your compliance. Discomfort in the person receiving a new boundary is common and does not automatically mean harm is being done. Learning to distinguish between someone's discomfort with change and genuine, legitimate concern is a skill that develops with practice. And the more you exercise it, the more precisely you will be able to tell the difference between pushback you should hold firm against and feedback genuinely worth reconsidering. Chapter 9. Confidence in Relationships, Family, and Work. The principles covered so far apply broadly, but they show up differently depending on the specific context in which you are practicing them. And it is worth walking through each major domain of life individually because the texture of over-explaining and the texture of confident boundary setting changes considerably depending on who you are talking to and what history exists between you. It is also worth noting how these dynamics shift within newer relationships versus long-established ones, since the amount of built-up expectation differs considerably between the two. In a new friendship or a new romantic relationship, there is generally more room to establish confident patterns early before either person has developed strong expectations about how much explanation the other typically provides. Long-established relationships, by contrast, often require a more deliberate renegotiation, since the other person has, over years, grown accustomed to a certain level of justification from you, and any sudden shift toward brevity may initially register as coldness or distance rather than growth. This does not mean the shift should be avoided in long-standing relationships, only that it may require more patience, more tolerance for an adjustment period, and occasionally a direct conversation acknowledging the change you are making and why, offered once, clearly, rather than repeatedly defended each time old patterns resurface. In romantic relationships, the stakes of this work feel especially high, because intimacy itself can become entangled with the belief that a good partner explains everything thoroughly. It is worth distinguishing clearly, once again, between transparency and justification. A healthy partnership involves transparency. Both people generally know what is going on in each other's lives, minds, and decisions. But transparency does not require constant justification for every individual choice within that transparency. You can tell your partner you are going out with friends on a particular evening without needing their explicit approval for the choice, while still being fully honest and forthcoming about your life as a whole. Confident partners negotiate genuinely shared decisions, finances, major life choices, parenting approaches, together, while still maintaining individual autonomy over smaller personal choices that do not require joint sign-off. Couples who struggle with this distinction often find themselves locked in cycles where every small decision becomes a negotiation, exhausting both people and slowly breeding resentment on both sides. The over-explainer, resentful of constantly needing to defend themselves, the partner resentful of feeling like every small thing has become a production. In family relationships, particularly with parents, this work often runs into the deepest resistance, precisely because family systems are usually where the original pattern was formed. It is genuinely difficult to speak to a parent with the same calm brevity you might use with a coworker, because the emotional wiring involved is decades old and deeply reinforced. A useful approach here is not to expect an overnight transformation in how these conversations feel, but to focus on small, repeated practice, choosing one low-stakes decision at a time, to state plainly rather than justify extensively, and allowing the discomfort that follows to exist without immediately retreating to the old pattern. Over time, family members often adjust their expectations based on the pattern you demonstrate consistently. Though this adjustment is rarely immediate and sometimes never happens completely, which is worth accepting honestly, rather than holding out for a guaranteed resolution that may never arrive. In friendships, over-explaining often shows up around questions of time and availability, apologizing extensively for not being able to attend every gathering, justifying the need for solitude or rest, or over-elaborating reasons for ending contact with a friendship that has run its course. Confident friendships tend to be built on a foundation where both people trust that the relationship can withstand normal, unremarkable moments of unavailability without requiring extensive explanation each time. Practicing brief, warm responses, "I can't make it this time," Hope you all have a great time. Without additional justification, tends to build exactly this kind of trust over repeated interactions, because it demonstrates that your affection for the friendship does not depend on attending every single event or being available at every single moment. In professional settings, the work involves distinguishing carefully between legitimate accountability, which we discussed in the previous chapter, and unnecessary personal justification that has simply become habitual. Declining additional responsibilities outside your defined role. Taking earned time off without extensive justification, or disagreeing with a colleague's approach without over-elaborating your reasoning, are all areas where many capable people undermine their own authority through excessive explanation. It is worth noting that in many professional environments, brevity is directly correlated with perceived seniority and competence. People in positions of genuine authority tend to communicate decisions concisely, trusting their judgment to stand without extensive defense, while people newer to a role or lower in a hierarchy often over-explain out of genuine uncertainty about whether their judgment will be trusted. Practicing concise, confident communication in professional settings, even before you feel fully confident internally, can itself become a mechanism for building that confidence, because the external behavior often precedes and reinforces the internal shift rather than only following it. It is worth mentioning parenting specifically as its own subcategory within family relationships, because it introduces a genuinely different dynamic than the ones covered so far. Children, particularly younger ones, do benefit developmentally from some degree of explanation, since part of raising a capable, reasoning adult involves modeling reasoning itself. The distinction here is not between explaining and not explaining, but between explaining calmly, once, as a teaching tool, and getting pulled into an escalating negotiation where a child, sensing hesitation, continues pushing until a boundary quietly dissolves. Confident parenting in this context looks like offering a brief, clear reason once if it genuinely serves the child's understanding, and then holding the boundary steady regardless of continued protest, without needing to produce an ever more elaborate justification each time the child pushes back. Across every one of these domains, the underlying practice remains the same, even as the specific language and stakes shift. Notice the impulse to over-explain. Pause before acting on it. Ask whether what follows is genuine information serving the relationship or anxious justification seeking approval. Choose accordingly, and allow whatever discomfort follows that choice to exist, without immediately working to eliminate it. This practice, repeated across enough contexts and enough time, is what eventually builds the deeper shift we turn to next, the rebuilding of trust in your own judgment. Chapter 10. Rebuilding Self-Trust. Everything covered in this audiobook so far has focused largely on external behavior. The language you use, the boundaries you set, the pushback you learn to withstand. But underneath all of that behavioral work sits a deeper project, one that ultimately determines whether the new habits will hold over time or eventually erode back into old patterns under enough pressure. That deeper project is the rebuilding of self-trust, the quiet, internal conviction that your own judgment is fundamentally reliable, even when it is imperfect, even when others disagree with it, and even when you cannot fully articulate every reason behind a particular choice. Self-trust is built the same way any other form of trust is built, through a consistent track record of evidence, gathered over time through direct experience, rather than through argument or persuasion. If you have spent years outsourcing your decisions to the approval of others, you likely do not yet have a large body of evidence demonstrating that your own judgment, unassisted by external validation, tends to work out reasonably well. This is not because your judgment is actually unreliable. It is because you have rarely given it the chance to operate independently long enough to prove itself to you. Rebuilding this trust requires deliberately creating opportunities to make decisions without seeking outside input, following through on those decisions, and then honestly evaluating the outcome, not through the lens of whether other people approved, but through the lens of whether the decision actually served you well in practice. This process benefits enormously from starting small. Attempting to rebuild self-trust by immediately making major, irreversible life decisions without any external input at all is not a wise strategy, and it is not what this chapter is suggesting. Instead, begin with genuinely low-stakes decisions: what to order at a restaurant without polling the table, which route to take somewhere without asking for confirmation it is the best one, how to spend a free afternoon without checking whether it sounds productive enough to others. These decisions might feel almost embarrassingly minor to focus on deliberately, but that is precisely their value. Low stakes mean low risk, which means you can practice the muscle of independent decision-making repeatedly, building genuine evidence of your own reliability without the pressure of consequences significant enough to trigger old anxious patterns. An important companion practice involves changing your relationship to being wrong. Much of the fear underlying both over-explaining and the broader lack of self-trust it stems from is a deep aversion to the possibility of making a mistake, particularly a mistake that might be witnessed and judged by others. Confident people are not people who make fewer mistakes than everyone else. They are people who have developed a different relationship to mistakes when they happen, treating them as information to be learned from rather than as evidence of some deeper, more permanent inadequacy. Building this relationship requires actively practicing self-compassion after a decision does not go as planned, resisting the urge toward harsh self-criticism, and instead asking practical, forward-looking questions. What can I learn from this? What would I do differently next time? This reframe matters enormously, because a person who fears mistakes catastrophically will always be tempted back towards seeking external validation before every decision, hoping that enough outside approval might somehow guarantee an outcome free of error. A person who has made peace with the inevitability of occasional mistakes no longer needs that guarantee, because they trust their own capacity to handle whatever outcome arises, which is the actual foundation confidence is built on. There is also real value in deliberately revisiting past decisions you once agonized over and evaluating them with the clarity that distance provides. Most people, looking back honestly at decisions they spent enormous energy justifying and second-guessing at the time, find that the outcome was rarely as catastrophic as their anxiety predicted, and often turned out reasonably well, regardless of whether it matched what others would have chosen for them. Collecting this evidence deliberately, rather than letting it pass by unexamined, helps build a more accurate internal record of your own decision-making history, one that counters the distorted narrative anxiety tends to construct, in which every choice feels perpetually uncertain and every outcome feels perpetually at risk. One more practice worth incorporating into this process is the deliberate act of noticing, in real time, the physical sensation that accompanies a decision made from genuine self-trust, as distinct from the sensation that accompanies a decision made to secure approval. Many people, after years of operating primarily from the second mode, have lost some ability to distinguish the two internally. A decision made from self-trust tends to carry a settled, grounded quality. Even amid uncertainty about the outcome, a sense of standing on solid footing, regardless of what happens next. A decision made to secure approval often carries a subtle, anxious quality even when it appears calm on the surface. A kind of bracing for reaction that never fully relaxes until external confirmation arrives. Practicing this internal check, pausing briefly before and after decisions to notice which of these two sensations is present, builds a kind of internal instrument you can rely on increasingly over time, one that becomes more sensitive and more trustworthy the more attention you give it. Finally, understand that rebuilding self-trust is not a linear process, and setbacks do not indicate failure of the overall project. There will be conversations where you slip back into old patterns of justification, moments where the fear of disapproval feels as strong as it ever did, and situations where holding a boundary without explanation feels nearly impossible. This is not evidence that the work is not working. It is simply evidence that old patterns, built over years or decades, do not dissolve permanently after a few weeks or months of new practice. What matters is the overall trajectory, the gradual, accumulating shift toward a life in which your decisions increasingly originate from your own internal compass, rather than from anticipated reactions, a shift that becomes more stable and more natural the longer you practice it, until one day, without any single dramatic turning point, you notice that explaining yourself has quietly stopped feeling like an obligation and started feeling simply like a choice you get to make or not make, entirely on your own terms. Chapter 11. The New Identity. Everything covered so far in this audiobook has focused on behavior, on the specific things you say and do differently in specific moments. But behavior alone, without a corresponding shift in identity, tends to feel effortful indefinitely, something you have to consciously remember to do rather than something you simply are. This chapter is about that deeper shift, the movement from someone who practices not over-explaining to someone who has actually become a person for whom over-explaining no longer fits, the same way an old habit you have genuinely outgrown no longer fits, not because you are suppressing the urge, but because the urge itself has quietly stopped arising in the first place. There is also a useful reframing worth adopting regarding how you measure progress in this identity shift, one that moves away from counting how many times you avoided over-explaining and toward noticing how quickly you recover when you do fall back into it. Early in this process, noticing yourself mid-justification and immediately stopping, mid-sentence if necessary, and simply saying, "Actually, let me just leave it there," is itself a meaningful marker of progress, arguably more meaningful than avoiding the pattern altogether from the start, because it demonstrates something the old identity never had: the capacity for real-time awareness and course correction rather than blind repetition of an old script running entirely on autopilot. Over time, these moments of mid-course correction tend to happen earlier and earlier in the pattern, until eventually they happen before the pattern even fully activates. But this earlier, cruder form of progress, catching yourself partway through and correcting anyway, deserves genuine recognition as real evidence of the shift already underway. Identity operates differently than behavior, and understanding this difference matters enormously for making this change permanent. Behavior is what you do in a given moment. Identity is the story you carry about what kind of person you fundamentally are. And this story exerts a powerful, often invisible influence over which behaviors feel natural and which feel like a performance you have to maintain through effort. If your underlying identity remains, "I am someone who needs approval to feel okay about my choices," then every boundary you set, every brief statement you manage to deliver without justification, will continue to feel like swimming against a current. Exhausting to sustain and easy to abandon under enough pressure or fatigue. But if the underlying identity itself shifts to something like, "I am someone whose judgment is my own to trust," then the behaviors covered throughout this audiobook stop requiring effortful practice and start simply being an accurate expression of who you already understand yourself to be. This shift does not happen through a single insight or a single dramatic decision, no matter how much we might wish it did. It happens the way most meaningful identity shifts happen, through accumulated evidence gathered from your own direct experience that slowly overwrites an older story that no longer serves you. Every time you hold a boundary without collapsing into justification, you are not just managing a single interaction, you are casting a vote for a new identity, adding one more piece of evidence to a growing case that you are, in fact, someone capable of trusting your own judgment without needing it ratified by everyone around you. Conversely, every time you fall back into old patterns, you are not failing completely or proving the work was wasted. You are simply continuing to gather mixed evidence, which is entirely normal and which does not erase the evidence you have already built in the other direction. There is a particular exercise worth engaging with directly, one that many people find uncomfortable at first, but genuinely clarifying over time. Take a moment to articulate, honestly, the identity you have been operating from for most of your life regarding this specific pattern. Perhaps it sounds something like, "I am someone who needs to be liked," or "I am someone whose decisions are only valid if others agree with them," or "I am someone who avoids conflict at almost any cost." Write this identity down, in your own words, exactly as it has actually functioned in your life, without softening it. Then, beside it, write the identity you are working to build instead, again, in your own specific words. "I am someone who trusts my own judgment. I am someone who can tolerate disagreement without needing to resolve it immediately. I am someone whose peace does not depend on unanimous approval." Reading both versions side by side, honestly, often reveals just how much of your past behavior makes complete sense given the old identity, which can be clarifying rather than shameful, because it reframes the entire pattern not as a personal failing, but as a logical consequence of a story you were operating from. A story that can now be consciously rewritten. It is worth naming honestly that this new identity will feel, for a period of time, somewhat unfamiliar, even slightly false, the way any new identity does before enough evidence accumulates to make it feel earned rather than aspirational. This discomfort is not a sign that the shift is not real or not working. It is simply the natural texture of growth. The gap between the person you are becoming and the person your nervous system still remembers being. Athletes describe something similar when adopting a new technique that is objectively better, but initially feels unnatural compared to old muscle memory. The discomfort fades not because you wait passively for it to fade, but because you continue practicing the new pattern consistently enough that it eventually becomes the memory your body and mind default to, replacing the old one not through force but through sheer accumulated repetition. One final aspect of this identity work deserves attention because it is easy to misunderstand. Becoming someone who does not over-explain is not the same as becoming someone who stops caring about the people in your life. And if the new identity you are building starts to feel cold, detached, or indifferent to others, something has gone slightly off track. The goal was never to care less. The goal was to stop confusing care with the need for approval. Two things that feel similar from the inside, but function very differently. A person with the new identity described in this chapter can care deeply about the people around them, can want good things for those relationships, and can hold real compassion for someone's disappointment, all while still not requiring that person's agreement as a precondition for their own sense of okayness. This is not a smaller, colder version of who you were. It is a more complete version, one capable of genuine connection, precisely because it is no longer built on a foundation of fear. There is a useful metaphor worth carrying with you as this identity work continues. The image of a plant that has spent years growing toward a wall, bending and adapting its shape entirely around an obstacle that once genuinely blocked its path. If that wall is eventually removed, the plant does not immediately grow straight. It continues, for a period of time, growing in the bent shape it learned, not because the wall is still there, but because that shape has become its structure, its default, its way of being a plant. Only through new growth, added deliberately over time, does the plant eventually straighten. And even then, the old, bent portion often remains visible, a permanent record of what it once had to adapt to, even as new, straighter growth extends beyond it. Your identity shift will likely follow a similar pattern. The old bent shape, the years of over-explaining, will not simply vanish, but it does not need to vanish in order for new, straighter growth to extend from where you are now, gradually becoming the larger, more defining part of who you are moving forward. Chapter 12. Confidence in the Age of Public Opinion. Everything discussed so far has largely focused on direct, personal interactions. Conversations with people who know you and whose opinions carry real emotional weight in your life. But the modern world has introduced an entirely new category of pressure to over-explain, one that did not exist for most of human history in anything like its current form: the pressure of public and semi-public opinion delivered through social media, group chats, comment sections, and the general awareness that almost any choice you make might, at some point, be visible to a much larger and more anonymous audience than the people directly in your life. This category of pressure operates differently than the personal pressure covered in earlier chapters, and it deserves its own examination because the strategies that work well in a direct conversation with someone who knows you do not always translate cleanly to this newer, more diffuse form of scrutiny. When a decision you make, a career change, a relationship choice, a lifestyle shift, becomes visible to a wider circle, whether through a social media post or simply through word reaching people you are not directly speaking to, there is a strong pull toward preemptively justifying that decision to an audience that is largely imagined, a collection of hypothetical critics whose specific objections you cannot actually predict, Because you do not know exactly who is watching or what they might think, this imagined audience deserves particular attention, because it is often far more punishing in the mind of the person anticipating its judgment than any real audience would actually be. Human beings evolved in small groups where social standing genuinely determined survival, and this ancient wiring does not distinguish well between the disapproval of a close-knit tribe you depend on for safety and the passing, largely inconsequential opinion of strangers or loose acquaintances scrolling past your life for a few seconds before moving on to something else. The result is a kind of chronic, low-grade anticipatory justification aimed at an audience that, in reality, is thinking about you far less than your anxious mind assumes, and whose opinions, even when genuinely held, carry almost none of the practical consequence that your nervous system is treating them as carrying. A useful practice here involves what might be called the audience audit, a deliberate exercise of identifying, specifically and honestly, who actually has legitimate standing to weigh in on a given decision in your life, as opposed to who simply has the technical ability to see it or comment on it. Legitimate standing generally belongs to people with real relational stake in the outcome. A partner genuinely affected by a major decision. A close friend whose counsel you have actively sought and value. A family member with whom you share ongoing responsibilities. Technical ability to comment belongs to nearly everyone else. Distant acquaintances, online strangers, people who follow your life from a comfortable distance without any actual investment in how things turn out for you. Confusing these two categories, treating the opinions of the second group with the same weight as the first, is one of the most exhausting and unnecessary burdens a person can carry, and consciously sorting people into their correct category is often enough, on its own, to significantly reduce the compulsion to justify yourself publicly. There is also a specific version of this pressure worth naming, one that arises not from strangers but from the semi-public nature of shared social circles, group chats, extended family threads, professional networks, where a decision you make might be discussed by people who know each other but not necessarily deeply know you, creating a strange middle ground between fully private and fully public scrutiny. In these spaces, information and opinion can circulate and compound in ways that feel particularly disorienting, since you may never directly witness the conversation happening about your choice, only sense its after-effects in subtly altered interactions afterward. The audience audit described above applies here as well, though it requires an additional layer of discernment, recognizing that even people with some genuine connection to you do not automatically have standing to weigh in on every decision simply because they happen to share a social circle or a group thread with people who do. It is worth addressing directly the specific temptation toward what might be called the public explanation post, the lengthy caption, the multi-part story, the carefully worded status update, explaining a decision to an audience that never actually demanded an explanation in the first place. This impulse deserves the same scrutiny applied throughout this audiobook to private over-explaining, because it operates through an identical mechanism, an attempt to secure approval before it has even been withheld, driven by anxiety about a judgment that has not actually been rendered. The healthier alternative is not necessarily complete silence about your life, since sharing genuinely from a place of connection rather than defense remains a valid and even valuable choice. The distinction, once again, comes back to the same test used throughout this audiobook. Are you sharing because you want to, from a place of security, Or are you sharing because you feel you must? From a place of anticipated judgment, you are trying to head off before it arrives. There is also real value in deliberately limiting your exposure to environments that reliably trigger this anxious, preemptive justification pattern, at least while you are actively working to build a stronger foundation of self-trust. This is not about permanently avoiding public life or social connection, but about recognizing honestly which specific platforms, group chats, or social contexts consistently leave you feeling compelled to explain yourself excessively, and giving yourself permission to step back from those environments during the period when your new identity is still relatively fragile and easily destabilized by repeated exposure to real or imagined scrutiny. As the internal shift described in the previous chapter solidifies, most people find they can re-engage with these environments without the same compulsive pull toward justification, because the underlying anxiety driving that pull has genuinely diminished rather than simply being avoided indefinitely. A related and often overlooked dimension of this pressure involves comparison, the quiet habit of measuring your own choices against the curated, incomplete glimpses of other people's lives that public platforms tend to display. Seeing others present their decisions with apparent ease and unanimous approval can create a distorted impression that confidence without explanation is somehow effortless for everyone else, that you are uniquely burdened by the compulsion to justify yourself. In reality, nearly everyone experiences some version of this pull, and the people who appear most unbothered online are often simply choosing not to display the internal negotiation that preceded their public ease, not because that negotiation did not happen. Remembering this can loosen the grip of comparison considerably, replacing a distorted sense of being uniquely deficient with a more accurate sense of being one, among many people quietly doing the same, difficult, worthwhile work. It is also worth acknowledging the specific pressure that arises when a decision genuinely does become a topic of wider conversation, whether through no fault or intention of your own, and the temptation this creates to address it publicly in an attempt to control the narrative before others shape it for you. While there are certainly professional or reputational contexts where some public communication genuinely serves a practical purpose, it is worth distinguishing this from the anxious impulse to explain purely because silence feels unbearable, while a narrative you did not author circulates without your input. Silence, uncomfortable as it feels in these moments, is rarely as damaging as it appears from the inside, and the compulsion to fill it with explanation is often driven less by strategic necessity and more by the same underlying anxiety this audiobook has spent so much time examining, now simply operating at a larger, more public scale. Chapter 13. The Freedom of Being Misunderstood. There is a particular kind of freedom available only on the other side of accepting something most people spend enormous energy resisting. The reality that you will, at various points, be misunderstood, and that this misunderstanding does not require correction in order for you to remain at peace. This chapter is about building tolerance for that specific discomfort, because it sits at the very core of everything this audiobook has been working toward. And without addressing it directly, all the language and boundary setting covered in previous chapters will eventually buckle under the weight of an unexamined fear that being misunderstood is somehow dangerous or unacceptable. It is worth acknowledging, before going further, that some degree of discomfort with being misunderstood is not itself a problem to be eliminated entirely. Caring how you are perceived by people who matter to you is a normal, healthy part of being a social creature embedded in relationships. And the goal of this chapter is not to manufacture total indifference to perception, which would be neither realistic nor genuinely desirable. The goal is proportion, ensuring that the intensity of your reaction to being misunderstood roughly matches the actual stakes involved, rather than treating every instance of misunderstanding, regardless of who holds it or how much it actually matters, with the same level of urgency and distress. Consider what actually drives the compulsion to correct every misunderstanding, to make sure everyone in your life has an accurate, complete picture of your reasoning, your intentions, and your character at all times. Beneath this compulsion usually sits a quiet, often unexamined belief that being misunderstood is a kind of danger, that if someone forms an inaccurate impression of you, something bad will happen as a result. A relationship will be damaged, an opportunity will be lost, your reputation will suffer in some lasting way. For most everyday situations, this belief, while understandable given how the nervous system is wired, does not hold up well under honest examination. Most misunderstandings, even significant ones, resolve themselves naturally over time through the accumulated evidence of how you actually live and behave, far more effectively than through any single explanation you might offer in the moment. There is also something worth naming about the sheer impossibility of the task most over-explainers have unconsciously set for themselves, the task of ensuring universal, complete understanding from every person who might ever form an opinion about them. This task is not merely difficult, it is genuinely impossible, because human beings interpret information through the lens of their own experiences, biases, and current emotional states, which means the exact same explanation, delivered identically to 10 different people, will be received 10 different ways. Some generous, some skeptical, some entirely missing the point, regardless of how clearly it was communicated. Once this impossibility is genuinely internalized, not just intellectually acknowledged but actually felt as true, much of the pressure driving compulsive explanation naturally loosens because the goal itself is revealed as unachievable, which makes continuing to chase it feel less like diligence and more like a particular kind of exhausting, doomed perfectionism. It is worth distinguishing here between being misunderstood by people who matter deeply to you and being misunderstood by people whose understanding carries little practical weight in your life, a distinction related to the audience audit covered in the previous chapter. Tolerance for misunderstanding does not mean abandoning genuine effort to be known and understood by the people closest to you, the ones with real relational stake in your life. Those relationships benefit from real communication, real vulnerability, and, yes, sometimes real explanation, offered from a place of connection rather than defense. What this chapter is addressing is the far more common and far more exhausting pattern of trying to manage the impressions of people whose understanding, however inaccurate, will have essentially no lasting impact on your actual life. The acquaintance who thinks you made a strange choice, the distant relative who disapproves of a decision they were never actually part of, the online stranger with a passing opinion about a life they know almost nothing about. Building genuine tolerance for this kind of misunderstanding is, in many ways, a form of grief work, because it requires letting go of a fantasy many people have carried since childhood. The fantasy that if you could just explain yourself well enough, clearly enough, thoroughly enough, everyone would eventually understand and approve. This fantasy is comforting precisely because it suggests a path forward, a solution. something you could theoretically achieve with enough effort. Letting it go means accepting a harder but ultimately more liberating truth, that some people will simply never understand certain choices you make, not because your explanation was insufficient, but because understanding was never actually available to them given who they are, what they value, and what they are capable of seeing from where they stand. This is not a failure on your part. It is simply the nature of being a specific, particular person, living a specific, particular life among other specific, particular people, each shaped by different experiences and different limitations. What replaces the exhausting pursuit of universal understanding, once you genuinely let it go, is something far more sustainable, a quieter, steadier form of self-possession that does not require constant external maintenance. You begin to notice that misunderstanding, when it happens, produces a brief flicker of discomfort, rather than a full-blown crisis requiring immediate resolution. You begin to notice that you can hold the thought someone has the wrong idea about this without that thought spiraling into an urgent need to correct it. This is not indifference, and it is not resignation. It is the specific, hard-won freedom of someone who has finally stopped outsourcing their sense of okayness to a project that was never actually completable in the first place. There is one more layer to this freedom worth naming clearly, which is the relief that arrives once you stop treating every relationship as equally important to preserve at full strength. Some relationships will not survive your growing unwillingness to over-explain yourself, and this is worth acknowledging honestly rather than glossing over. A relationship that depended heavily on your constant justification, whether through a friend who enjoyed the role of advisor and judge, or a family member accustomed to having full narrative control over your choices, may genuinely change shape once that dynamic shifts, sometimes becoming distant, sometimes ending altogether. This is a real cost, and pretending it is not would be dishonest, but it is worth weighing against the alternative. A lifetime spent maintaining relationships that require the ongoing surrender of your own autonomy as the price of their continuation, which is not really preservation at all, but a slow, quiet erosion dressed up as connection. There is also a subtle but important distinction between accepting misunderstanding and becoming careless about how you communicate altogether. Tolerating the reality that some misunderstanding is inevitable does not mean abandoning thoughtfulness, clarity, or basic consideration in how you express yourself. It simply means releasing the expectation that thoughtful, clear communication guarantees a specific outcome, namely full agreement and approval from everyone who receives it. You can continue to communicate with care and precision while simultaneously releasing your grip on controlling exactly how that communication lands in someone else's mind, two things that can coexist far more easily than the anxious, over-explaining pattern ever allowed you to notice. Chapter 14. Practicing this for life. Insight alone does not create lasting change, no matter how clear or compelling that insight feels in the moment you receive it. If you have made it this far in this audiobook, you likely already understand, on an intellectual level, most of what has been covered, why over-explaining developed, what it costs, how confident people operate differently, and what language and boundaries can help shift the pattern. But understanding a pattern and actually living differently because of that understanding are separated by a gap that only sustained, deliberate practice can close. And this chapter exists to help you build a realistic, sustainable practice that will carry this work forward long after the specific words of this audiobook have faded from memory. It is worth naming honestly why so many people absorb material like this, feel genuinely moved and convinced by it in the moment, and then find themselves, weeks later, behaving almost exactly as they did before encountering it. The gap is rarely a failure of understanding. It is almost always a failure of translation. The absence of a concrete bridge between an abstract idea, however compelling, and the specific, granular behavior required in a specific, real moment with a specific person. This chapter exists to help you build that bridge deliberately, rather than hoping it constructs itself automatically, simply because the underlying idea made sense to you. Begin by accepting a truth that will save you significant frustration down the road, that this work does not proceed in a straight line. There will be weeks where holding boundaries without justification feels almost effortless, where the new identity described earlier in this audiobook feels solid and natural. There will be other weeks, often triggered by stress, fatigue, or a particularly difficult relational dynamic, where old patterns resurface with surprising intensity, where you find yourself over-explaining a decision as thoroughly as you might have years ago, seemingly without the new awareness making any difference at all in that moment. This is not evidence of failure or of wasted effort. It is simply the accurate, unglamorous shape that behavior change actually takes for virtually everyone who has ever successfully made it. A spiral rather than a straight line, generally trending in the right direction over time, even while containing real regressions along the way. A practical structure worth adopting is a regular, brief period of reflection, perhaps once a week, in which you honestly review moments from the previous days where you either successfully held a boundary without over-explaining or noticed yourself falling back into old justification patterns. This reflection is not about self-criticism, and approaching it with harshness will undermine its usefulness considerably. It is about building the kind of honest, ongoing awareness that makes change possible, noticing patterns, noticing which specific situations or people tend to trigger the old habit most reliably, and using that information to prepare more deliberately for those situations going forward, rather than being caught off guard by them repeatedly. It is also worth identifying, specifically, the people and contexts in your life most likely to test this work, because generic practice rarely holds up as well as targeted practice. For most people, the hardest environments are the ones with the deepest history. A particular family member whose approval you have chased for decades, a specific friendship built on a long-standing pattern of extensive justification, a professional relationship with someone whose opinion has always carried outsized weight in your mind. Rather than hoping these specific relationships will simply resolve themselves as a byproduct of general practice elsewhere, it is worth bringing deliberate, focused attention to them, perhaps even mentally rehearsing how you want to show up the next time a familiar triggering situation arises with that particular person, so that when the moment actually comes, you have already done some of the preparatory work, rather than having to build your response entirely from scratch under real-time pressure. Community and reflection of some kind, whether through trusted friends who understand what you are working on, a therapist, or simply consistent private journaling, tend to significantly increase the durability of this kind of change. Attempting this work in complete isolation, relying purely on internal willpower without any external structure of accountability or reflection, is possible but considerably harder, because the old pattern of over-explaining was itself built and reinforced within a social context, and unwinding it often benefits from a different kind of social context, one where you can be honest about setbacks without shame, and can receive genuine encouragement for progress that might otherwise go unnoticed and uncelebrated. There is also value in periodically revisiting the specific ideas covered throughout this audiobook, not because you will forget them intellectually, but because the emotional resonance of a given idea often shifts depending on what you are currently facing in your life. A concept that felt somewhat abstract on a first listen can land with entirely new force months later, in the middle of a specific relationship or decision where its relevance suddenly becomes concrete rather than theoretical. This is not a sign that the first listen failed to teach you anything. It is simply how deep behavioral change tends to work, layered rather than instant, with different parts of the same material becoming useful at different points along your own particular timeline. Finally, resist the temptation to treat this work as something with a clear finish line, a point at which you will have arrived once and for all at a permanently confident version of yourself who never again feels the pull toward justification. This framing sets up an unrealistic and ultimately discouraging standard. A more accurate and more sustainable framing understands this as an ongoing practice, similar to physical fitness or any other skill that atrophies somewhat without continued attention, one that deepens and becomes more natural with years of practice, while still occasionally requiring conscious effort during particularly difficult periods or particularly triggering relationships for the rest of your life. This is not a discouraging thought once you sit with it fully. It means you do not need to achieve some impossible, permanent state of perfection before the work counts as successful. Every single instance of holding a boundary without unnecessary justification throughout your entire life counts as a genuine, complete success in its own right, regardless of how many times you might fall back into old patterns on other occasions. One more practical element worth building into your ongoing practice is a short list, kept somewhere easily accessible, of the specific bridge phrases and declarative statements covered earlier in this audiobook that felt most natural to you personally. Not every phrase will resonate equally, and part of making this practice sustainable involves identifying the specific language that fits your own voice, your own tone, and your own relationships, rather than trying to adopt every technique uniformly. Revisiting this personalized list occasionally, especially before a conversation you anticipate will be difficult, can serve as a quick, practical anchor, reducing the likelihood that old patterns take over simply because a better alternative was not readily available in the moment it was needed most. Chapter 15. The Final Threshold. We have covered a great deal of ground together, from understanding exactly why over-explaining develops and what it costs, through the deep psychological mechanics separating confidence from justification, through practical language and strategies for handling real pushback, through the specific textures of this work across relationships, family, and career, and finally into the deeper identity work required to make any of this permanent, rather than a temporary set of techniques applied under pressure. What remains is a final, simple threshold. The moment when understanding becomes action, when everything you have absorbed throughout this audiobook either quietly fades back into old patterns or becomes the foundation of a genuinely different way of living. Take a moment, before continuing, to notice which specific ideas from this audiobook landed most powerfully for you personally, because different listeners will find different chapters resonate most strongly depending on their own particular history and current circumstances. Perhaps it was the origin story covered early on, the recognition of exactly where this pattern first took root in your own life. Perhaps it was the concrete language and scripts, finally giving shape to an instinct you had sensed but never quite known how to execute. Perhaps it was the deeper identity work, the recognition that lasting change requires more than technique alone. Whichever ideas resonated most, consider returning to that specific material first when you find yourself needing reinforcement, since the parts that moved you most on this listen are likely to be the parts most capable of moving you again when old patterns threaten to resurface. Consider what your life might actually look like on the other side of this threshold, not in some vague, aspirational sense, but in specific, concrete terms. Picture a decision arriving, a request you need to decline, a boundary you need to set, a choice someone in your life will not fully understand or approve of. Picture yourself stating that decision clearly, once, without the familiar rush of justification, following immediately behind it. Picture the brief silence that follows, and picture yourself simply allowing that silence to exist without scrambling to fill it. Picture the other person's reaction, whatever it happens to be, and picture yourself acknowledging it with warmth, if warmth is genuine, without treating that reaction as evidence that your decision requires revision or additional defense. This is not a fantasy reserved for naturally confident people who were somehow born without the fear this audiobook has spent so much time examining. This is available to you, built the same way it is built by everyone who has ever walked this path before you, through repeated, deliberate practice, through tolerating discomfort long enough for it to lose its grip, through gradually accumulating evidence that your own judgment can be trusted without requiring universal agreement first. It is worth returning, one final time, to the core distortion this entire audiobook has been working to correct. The belief, absorbed so early and so thoroughly that it rarely announces itself as a belief at all, that your choices require a defense before they can be considered legitimate. This belief was never actually true, even during the years you spent living as though it were. Your choices were always yours to make. Your reasoning was always yours to keep private if you chose to. And your worth was never actually contingent on securing anyone else's approval, no matter how convincingly it may have felt otherwise. What has changed over the course of this audiobook is not some external permission finally being granted to you. What has changed is your own recognition of a permission that was always already yours, waiting only for you to notice it, claim it, and begin living from it, consistently rather than occasionally, in moments of unusual courage, before slipping back into old, more familiar patterns. There will be setbacks. There will be conversations where the old pull toward justification feels as strong as it ever did. Relationships where this work proves especially slow and especially difficult. Days where you catch yourself mid-explanation and feel a flicker of frustration at not yet having fully arrived at the person you are working to become. Let this be expected rather than discouraging. Every person who has ever built genuine confidence, the kind that does not require constant external maintenance, built it exactly this way, imperfectly, gradually, through far more failed attempts than successful ones in the early stages, until eventually the successful attempts began to outnumber the failed ones, and then eventually became the clear, comfortable default rather than the effortful exception. The people in your life who genuinely love and respect you will not lose that love or respect because you stop over-explaining yourself to them. If anything, most relationships deepen when both people can trust that boundaries mean what they say, that a no is a complete sentence rather than an opening bid in a negotiation, that closeness does not require the surrender of individual judgment. And the people who do respond poorly, who push harder, who seem to have relied on your over-explaining as a way of maintaining influence over your choices, are revealing something important about the actual nature of that relationship. Information that is valuable to have clearly, even when it is painful to receive. There is one last thing worth saying plainly. Because it is easy, after absorbing this much material, to feel as though the work ahead is enormous, a mountain of practice and vigilance stretching endlessly into the future. In truth, the work is made of nothing more than single, individual moments. One decision at a time, one boundary at a time, one silence held a little longer than felt comfortable, one bridge phrase offered instead of an old, familiar justification. You do not need to transform every relationship in your life at once, and you do not need to master every technique covered in this audiobook before any of it begins to count. Growth of this kind accumulates the same way it always has for every person who has ever built it. Quietly, unevenly, one ordinary moment stacked upon another, until one day the accumulated weight of those moments becomes, without any single dramatic turning point you could point to, simply who you are. You were never actually required to explain yourself to anyone whose only claim on your reasoning was their own discomfort with not having it. You are allowed to make decisions that others do not understand. You are allowed to hold boundaries that others find inconvenient. You are allowed to trust your own judgment, imperfect as it will sometimes be, without waiting for a verdict from people who were never going to have to live with the consequences of your choices the way you will. This is not permission you needed to be given. It was always yours. The only remaining question, the one this entire audiobook has been building toward, is whether you are ready to finally start living as though you believe it. The next time a decision arrives, and it will arrive soon, perhaps even today, you will know exactly what to do. Make the choice, state it clearly, and let that be enough.